Good evening. I shall resign the presidency at noon tomorrow.
This is an historic day, the only time a president has ever resigned from office.
Nixon knew about the Watergate cover-up.
The man who has committed the greatest felony in American history will never stand trial.
I've had an idea for an interview. Richard Nixon.
Would I want to talk to David Frost?
I got $500,000.
Really?
Peter, you chose to write it as a theater piece, and then obviously adapted it for the screen. So why did you choose initially to write this piece for the stage, and then what were the challenges in adapting it?
The reason I wanted to write it for the stage was because I was sort of fed up with being a screenwriter at the time. And I'd had this in my mind as a play for about 10 years by this point. And I just didn't have the courage, or to be honest with you, the confidence to try it. But at this point, I threw caution to the wind and just booked myself a flight to Washington and started meeting people.
So Ron, you see this play in London. At what point do you see a movie in it?
I read the play, and I was frankly very, very surprised at just how wildly entertaining it was. And when I saw, I then knew people were interested, made it my business to go and see it right away, and I was sort of surprised all over again. I was doing two things during the course of the play. One, I was right there with the audience, just enjoying it thoroughly, and falling in love with it as a story. And I was also looking and thinking, that's a fantastic theatrical device. I love the way that's staged. How would I ever get that? What would I do to open it up? And I had a sense of what I thought I could do with it as a director. And I also felt that while I knew casting discussions would go on and on and on, that I'd be really thrilled and felt I could make a great movie with Michael and Frank. And so it wasn't going to have to be cast contingent. I never had made that kind of leap before, ever.
Michael, you and Frank had done this show 350 times with, I think, about 24 hours off between ending the show and starting the film. As an actor, is that a blessing or is that a curse to go from the same part but in a totally different medium that quickly?
Well, I was glad that it wasn't too long a break and I'd have to relearn the lines. So at least it was the first time I've ever turned up on a film set and knew all the lines of the entire film to begin with. And I mean, that sounds flippant, but it was actually extraordinary it probably will never happen again in my career, I don't know, but to turn up to start a film where the one thing you're most certain about and confident about is the character and who these people are, because we sort of got used to that, and to know exactly what the arc is and the journey is, and to not have to worry about jumping around in time filming it because that story was so implanted in our minds.
When you're playing characters that are that well known, at a certain point does it become an obstacle that the reference becomes the caricature, that at a certain point you have to divorce yourself from what the public's perception of how that character should be depicted?
In my case, very much so, because I was determined that I would not play a drunk or a crook. I was determined, and it wasn't until well into rehearsals at the Dunmore when I started digging very deep into his soul that I began to find him. The first 2 weeks, I don't know what Mike was going through. Mike had David so well right away. I sounded like Jimmy Stewart for a week. I sounded like Mr. Magoo for a week. And it really was difficult. But when I began to dig deep into his soul, and when I went and sat in the room where he spent the first 9 years of his life, I lost all sense of what I thought the public would expect of me. I just began to find my Nixon.
In doing the research and meeting so many people who had worked with him, one thing that was clear was that anybody who'd been around him for any period of time, despite whatever their political leanings might be today, and in some instances people have changed a great deal, they maintain this deep, abiding respect for Nixon's intellect, his geopolitical vision, his work ethic. But the other thing is that none of them could avoid doing the really bad imitation that Frank didn't do. I mean, they'd all have to say, and then he'd look at me and he'd say, well, why are you wearing that suit on a day like that? It didn't matter how much they loved him. They just had to do it.
I want to thank Peter, Michael, Frank, and Ron, and thank you all for sticking around.